All right, happy Friday, everybody. This is the 25th Automation Hour webinar series. I'm Jennifer Lee, your co-host, along with David Litton and Rakesh Gupta, and our guest speaker today, Adam Kramer. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, all lines will be muted. There is the chat function that you can use to post your questions throughout the presentation. It could be anything related to Adam's presentation or a general process automation question. And if we are not able to get to your question, we will continue on with the discussion on our Success Community Salesforce Automation Hour. So after the session, we will have posted on our website, Automation Hour, as well as the Success Community and our YouTube channel, the recording, as well as the presentation. So for our new series, this is the second one of the series where we're going to cover 4 beginner sessions, then immediate sessions, and advanced. So second one in the series for today. And we can't do this without our sponsor, Concrete.io, so thanks, shout out to them. And here are your co-hosts. This was from Southeast Dreamin'. And I also want to note that we're really excited that we're joining forces with System.debug, 2Wit, and the Gift Squad as Hunger Cast, raising funds for feeding Texas. And we do want to note that all proceeds will go to this charity. There are many designs. I'm only showing 2 of them on screen, but there's many designs and colors to choose from, and they cost $25 each. So I would encourage those to follow the link and give to charity. So I do want to thank Brian James from System.debug for including us in this initiative. And if you do happen to purchase a t-shirt that has our Automation Hour logo on that, tweet that out to us and @mention David, Rakesh, and I. And with that, we're excited to have Adam on today. He is a fellow MVP, and he will be speaking to us today about a nonprofit use case for automating organization affiliation. So let me change handoff to Adam.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen here. And which screen are you seeing right now? Is it the slides or is it a process builder process?
Slides.
Thanks.
All right, excellent. All right, so yes, I am a fellow MVP with Rakesh and Jennifer Lee. I have been in the Salesforce space for about 6 years now. Well, closer to 7. I started off as an admin of a nonprofit in New Orleans, the New Orleans area, Habitat for Humanity, and we migrated from a legacy system to Salesforce with the help of a consulting partner, and I immediately fell in love with Salesforce and saw what a huge improvement it was on our processes and systems at my nonprofit. And I wanted other nonprofits to help realize that, and so I reached out to the consulting partner I was working with and decided to become a consultant full-time and help other nonprofits realize that. And so I was doing that for about 5 to 6 years, and I recently switched over to becoming an admin again. And I'm working at a large nonprofit, RAND, where I'm the manager of Salesforce and sort of rolling out the system organization-wide right now. We have our development department and communications department already up and running on Salesforce, but the goal is to get everybody managing all of their contacts through Salesforce in sort of a traditional CRM contact management system, and also have some other interesting use cases that might be coming down the line. So it's a pretty exciting project to be working on. But today I am here to talk about, let's not forget, oh, I think I went backwards. Sorry about that. All right, so today I am here to talk about organization affiliations. And this is a junction object in the Nonprofit Success Pack, which my org is running, and actually most nonprofits on Salesforce are running, definitely the vast majority of nonprofits on Salesforce. And the organization affiliation is a simple junction object between account and contact. And this has existed for close to 10 years, I want to say, this object. And when Salesforce introduced the contact many account functionality about a year ago, the overwhelming consensus from salesforce.org was to not use that native Salesforce functionality. It was to stick with the organization affiliation junction object. And there are several reasons for that. The biggest of which is that this is still a true object in Salesforce, whereas the account or contact to many accounts isn't quite a first-class full object. Triggers aren't available, certain field types aren't available, you can't do automation around certain things. And so while it's great that Salesforce rolled that out, I really do feel that this object is a lot better for many reasons, and it's a simple junction object. So here is sort of the schema. We've got account and contact, and then master detail relationship from the affiliation object to both contact and account. They've relabeled account organization in this object. And what this allows is you to have many relationships to different organizations, which is great for the nonprofit world and the nonprofit space, because we have, contacts who are affiliated with all sorts of organizations. They're on the board of this organization, and they work for this other organization, and they, all sorts of different reasons why you're tracking, and they donate to this other one. And so to be able to list all of that out in their full sort of relationship and affiliation history is great. You can also have multiple affiliations to the same organization. So if they used to be the CEO, but now they are, something else at the org, then you can have both of those and have the history listed out fully throughout time. And so really a lot of great use cases for the affiliation object. And one nice thing about NPSP, or the Nonprofit Success Pack, is that it also tracks a primary affiliation. And so they've rightfully thought that just because someone is affiliated to a whole bunch of organizations, you as an organization or you as a user probably care about one of those relationships more than the rest, probably the place they work or the place that they do most of their interactions with your organization through. So if they're on the board of a foundation or something like that. And so you can specify what affiliation is their primary affiliation. And that is important. So we've got an organization listed out here, the Save the World Foundation, and we can see sort of all the standard information about that account. From there, we can see that we do not have any affiliated contacts. This is a different related list than just the standard contact related list. In the NPSP data architecture, basically every contact exists underneath a household account and then is affiliated to business accounts through this organization affiliation object. And so to look at the related list of affiliated contacts, we see that none exist for this account. And here we have John Smith, and we want to affiliate him with the Save the World Foundation. And so from John Smith's record, we are going down to organization affiliations, and we'll just click New. And so when you do that, you can do that from either record, just sort of know where you're starting, and it'll fill in different information. So you would fill out the organization as just a regular account. That's a master detail lookup to account. You would fill out the contact, and then some of this is custom to my org, and that's sort of what I wanted to show, not just the standard functionality of NPSP, but some customizations we've done on top of that. And so here we have his position. And we also have a status, start date, and end date. And what NPSP does out of the box is it will create that lookup to the primary affiliation, if that checkbox is checked, directly on the contact record. And so you have another lookup to account besides the standard account lookup, which would be to his household account. You have another, which is right here, the Smith household. We have another lookup to account that is this person's primary affiliation. But that is all that NPSP does out of the box. What if we wanted to know the position or the status of that position? Maybe this was a former position and he's no longer working at that org. Yes, we could get there through reporting or looking at the related list, but oftentimes you want that directly on the contact record itself for simpler reporting or just for at-a-glance display of information or merging or maybe further automating based on other things on the contact record. In my org, we have the ownership of the contacts is extremely important. And the owners of the contacts want to be notified when key changes are made on their contact records. And so one of those changes that we had to keep track of was changes to their affiliation. And since that is often a separate object, we would have to introduce more notifications and more subscriptions and notifications to users based on another object when we already had one on the contact object. And so we have set some history tracking directly on the contact object based on these new fields that are filled in from a process builder process, which I will show you in a minute. And so the primary affiliation position and status are being populated automatically by a process builder process, where NPSP just fills out that account lookup for us. Now, I know that NPSP out of the box does have a role field, which does fill out some information on the contact record. In our org, that didn't work for a couple of reasons that I'm not going to go into. I just want to show you that it's possible to do this with a custom field that we created, the position field on the affiliation, and a standard NPSP field, which is that status field. And so sort of both of those are on there for those reasons. And I know that role often fills that times for a lot of nonprofit organizations. All right, so let's get out of here and let's hop into our org. All right, so I am in a sandbox and we want to go to Process Builder, which we want to access through Setup. And if it isn't obvious, I am using the Lightning interface, and all of this definitely still works in Classic and can be done using Salesforce Classic. It's just we recently actually just switched over for a couple key users in my org to Lightning, and so I am super excited about it right now and want to do as much as possible in Lightning, and I suggest everybody should want to do the same. It's really, really getting to the point where there are fewer and fewer reasons to stay in Classic, especially with some of the things they have coming in winter. It looks really nice. All right, so for Process Builder, we want to go to Process Automation and Process Builder. Of course, if you can't remember any of that, you can always just start typing in that quick find box and anything with process will show up. And we'll go to Process Builder. And I am going to, even though I already have this created, I'm going to start from scratch here with a new process. And generally speaking, you want to have as few processes per object as possible. And so ideally, we would just have one affiliation process where everything that gets automated off the affiliation would be off the affiliation process. That, of course, is going to fill out our API name. We can give it a description, which we can alter over time if we want to list out each and every one of those automations that occurs in this process. But for now, I'm just going to keep this simple. Affiliation processes. And the key part is, when do we want this to start? And for this, we want it when a record changes. And so we will hit save and jump into Process Builder. All right, so first thing, we have to choose an object. What object are we evaluating changes to? And again, you can start scrolling through a list like this, and it's right at the top, or you can start typing. I always prefer typing to narrow that list down. And so, affiliation. And when do we want this to evaluate? And very important to understand the differences between the two. Do we want it only when the record is created, and so it'll never look at it again when edits are made? Or do we want it when it's created or edited? And for this, we want it when it's created or edited, because something that was not somebody's primary position might be, or someone might forget to fill out the position and fill it out later, or their position might change, or their status might go from current to former. And so all sorts of reasons why edits to the record should trigger the automation that we want to happen in this case. Now, there is this advanced recursion feature, which I'm basically going to say don't check. There are very, very, very few times that you want to check this off. Essentially, it can cause lots of problems and should only be checked if you really need to. I'm not going to dive into too more detail there, but basically forget that that exists for almost every use case you have with Process Builder, at least in my opinion. All right, so we hit save, and we want to go down to the first criteria that we want to evaluate. And for me, I like using the conditions when possible. It's a nice, easy, declarative way of doing Process Builder. But for this use case, I am actually going to start to write out a formula. And with the formula, we can specify a lot of different things. And since most of our criteria is going to be the same, we can copy and paste pretty easily to create this formula. I know it looks a lot more intimidating and complicated than it actually is. I know the first time I started using Salesforce, formulas were definitely intimidating to me, but Process Builder really has a great way of allowing for point-and-click formula building. And so the first thing we want to think about is if there is a new affiliation record created. And there is a function for that. And so if we just look at all function categories and start typing, and I start typing new, we see an isNew function. So this just means if there is a new record created for an affiliation. With formulas, people have different styles. I like to use the double ampersand to concatenate my ands. Other people like to use the and function. They can serve as the same thing. I think it's a lot easier to read with everything written out on its own line like this. A lot of people definitely disagree with me there. So either this or the and with everything in parentheses will work totally fine for what we're doing here. And so another thing we want in any Process Builder process, we always want to check for blank values. The probably most common reason that any process will fail is because it's trying to update something that doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist because there's either not a value for it or some relationship that you're building off that process doesn't exist. And so every process builder I build has a bunch of null checks in it. I probably go overboard with my null checks. I am paranoid about a process builder failing, and I like to make sure that I am checking for null values when they possibly could not exist. For example, this is a master detail relationship to contact and account, and so it wouldn't be possible to create a record without a value in contact or account, but I am still going to do a null check for those values anyway. That's how paranoid I am about this. I've seen a lot of nasty process builder errors in my time, and better safe than sorry, in my opinion. And so we are simply going to write out, and we want a not, because the function we're looking for here is, and this sometimes takes a minute, there we go, is null. And it's telling us we need an expression within there. And so what are we checking to be null? And we're looking for a field. And all of our fields on the affiliation exist. And so I am going to type in organization to find the field we're looking for. Now, the difference between these two organization fields is that if I click on this one, it will take me to the account object. Remember that organization is just a master detail lookup to account. And so by clicking on this, it's going to take me all the way to the account object if I wanted to do some sort of checking on the account object as well. Very nice thing about Process Builder is you can go through the objects you have relationships to. But what I want to do here is really just check for that lookup being filled out. And that's what this value here is. That is saying that the organization field on the record, that is what this one is. That's the API name of that field. And so we're going to choose that. And next thing we want to do a null check for, which I put on a separate line. And since I have that format already figured out, I can just sort of copy what I did there without having to click and find all those things. And let's find a field. And this time we want the contact. Again, we don't want the contact that's going to take us to the actual contact object and look for records there. We want the field that is actually performing that lookup, which is the one with that API name listed out. So we're going to choose that. And we want, because I am saying that in this criteria, we are looking for the position in the affiliation, I'm going to say not is null. And we are going to put in position. And as I'm building this out, I've noticed I've missed a couple parentheses. You always want your total number of parentheses to equal what you have written out. And so we see that we have an open parentheses for the is null and a close parentheses for it, but I forgot to put one in for that not there. So I'll just put one there. And because we have a not and it is null here, I need two close parentheses as well and two close parentheses there. We just always want them to equal the same amount. And so the last thing we want to check for is to make sure that this is a primary affiliation. And the nice thing about this is it's a checkbox. And so we can just put the field in. And if I put in primary, we don't have to say is true or anything like that. A nice thing about checkboxes is if you just put the field in, that's assuming it's true. And so what this formula is saying is if we have a new affiliation record created and the organization isn't blank and the contact isn't blank and the position isn't blank and primary is selected, then it's going to evaluate to true. And so now we have one of my use cases for position filled out. And what we want to do is go through and we are actually going, and let me actually use the function here. Oh, I am getting lost. Oh, sorry, it's an operator. I'm clicking in the wrong places. We want an or here because we're saying if any of this is true, or we're going to have a whole new set of conditions. One thing about introducing an or statement is we definitely want to segregate that out from everything else. And so we want anything within this top section to be true, or anything within the section that comes after it. And because I am doing a formula, we can basically copy a lot of this and paste it in because we're really looking for a lot of the same conditions. And so we want the organization not to be null, the affiliation not to be null, the position, and here we are going to say yes, also not null, but we want our first piece of criteria to be slightly different. And what we want here is not if it's a new record, but we want if something is changed. And let's go to all function categories again, and if I start typing changed, we find is changed. And we could grab this position, copy and paste it in there, or if you feel more comfortable, just look for it in our point and click editor. And there we go. So now what we're saying is if it's new and the organization isn't blank and the contact isn't blank and the position isn't blank and it's the primary affiliation, or if the position is changed, all the blank checks and it's primary. And we want one more sort of use case here that I've noticed my users do, and that is if the primary wasn't selected and then it is selected later. And so basically I'm just going to take everything we had before and we want is changed, but the thing we want changed this time is primary. And so we're just going to look in here, find primary, and we see that if primary is changed and this organization isn't blank and contact isn't blank and position isn't blank and primary is true, then we want this to evaluate as true. So it's nice that we have both of these in here because we see that is changed. You might think, oh, what if someone changed it from it being true to it being false? We might need a prior value or some other thing to check to make sure that they were changing it to actually being true. But because we have this statement down here about primary essentially being true, that is going to catch that. And so this is what we have for our formula. There as I'm writing this out. There are definitely cleaner ways of writing this using fewer lines, but this is sort of the most, in my mind, clearest way of doing it, because we have everything in its own section and we can see what each one is evaluating as. So we are going to hit save there. Oh, and I'm missing a parenthesis somewhere. Interesting. Always my favorite thing about a live building of a formula. Fortunately, I already have that built out, so I'm just going to, instead of troubleshooting where I'm missing that parenthesis, hit save. All right, and so now what do we want to happen when this is evaluated as true? And so we want an immediate action to happen, and we want to update a record. And what record do we want to update? Do we want to update the affiliation that was just created or edited? Or do we want to update a record that's related to it? And we want that one that's related. And we're going to choose contact. And again, we have a couple of options. We could go from the contact to another object, and that's what that selection would do. Or we could just update the contact directly, which is what the one without the caret. All right, so we're going to update the contact from the affiliation, and we want to update that field that's on the contact record called primary affiliation position. And what do we want to update it to? We could hard code a value with the string, but what we're going to do, we could do a formula. We are referencing what was on that affiliation record. And so by choosing reference, we are going to find a field, and we're on the affiliation object because that's where we started this whole process. And what we want is position. And so this is going to take the position from the affiliation and put it on this primary affiliation position field on the contact record when any of those conditions are met in our criteria here. And let's hit, oh, I need to give it a name, don't I? Primary affiliation position contact. All right, so now we have one of our fields built out, and I'm going to go a little bit quicker through the next one so we have plenty of time for questions and things along those lines. But what we want to do is now do the same exact thing, but for status. And so let's build another formula in a new criteria node. We'll give it a name, primary affiliation status. And I am going to sort of take a pre-baked cake out of the oven here. But essentially, this is almost exactly the same thing that we had in the previous criteria. We're saying, is it new? We want the organization not to be null. We want the contact not to be null. Instead of position not being null, we want status not to be null. And we still want it to be primary. Or we want the status changed and the organization not to be null, the contact not to be null, the affiliation status not to be null, and it to be primary. Or if the primary checkbox is checked off, and all of that again. So you probably see one additional function in this formula that was not in the previous one, and that is the text function. What this does is it takes a pick list and translates that pick list value into text. There are only certain functions that work directly on pick lists, And so in order for us to evaluate if it's null or not, we need to translate that pick list value into a text value. It's a common function that you see with any formula involving a pick list, but it very, very necessary for you to use a lot of functions related to pick lists. And so we want to hit save here. And we want another immediate action to fire. And we want to update a record. And let's give it a name and primary affiliation status contact. And what record do we want to update? We want a record related and contact. And what field are we updating? We want the status. Ooh, a lot of status fields. Primary affiliation status. And we want to reference. Again, tricking myself here. Because this is a pick list, we're going to have to use that text function again. And so instead of a reference, we're going to use a formula. And to build that formula, we can put in that function. And so if we're back here in our formula builder, and I type in text, and what are we turning into text? What value are we turning into text? We're taking a field. And again, we're starting on the affiliation object. And so we're just looking for that position. No, not position, status. Confusing myself here. And there we go. Field is required. Use this formula. I tried to hit save because I didn't see the use this formula button there. What this does is it just takes it and pastes it in here. There we go. And we can hit save. Now, the most important thing about building multi-step process builder processes is looking at each piece of criteria and following the flow, and following these lines and sort of all of this logic. So we see that we start evaluating when an affiliation is created or edited. Great, okay, so let's move down to the next thing. So if the primary affiliation position, if any of this is true, it's going to go this way, following the true arrow. And what it's going to do is one immediate action and update the contact record with the field we're updating is the primary affiliation position on contact with the position from the affiliation. Now we see that once it does that update, it's going to stop. It's not going to go down here and look at the next criteria. If this had been false, that's what it would have done. It would have said, nope, nothing here happened, so let's look at the next one and see if anything happened. However, we can change the logic on this, and this was probably the most important update to Process Builder that they've made, in my opinion. It's probably about a year to 2 years ago, year and a half ago, where you can change what happens when it evaluates something as true. And if we click the stop right here, we can say evaluate the next criteria. And when we hit save there, we'll see the image update to show us that, oh, when it reaches the end of this line, it's going to shoot down to the next one. It doesn't have to be false now to shoot down to the next criteria. And when you are building Process Builder processes with multiple criteria, you always want to make sure that it's evaluating the next criteria when appropriate. It's not always appropriate. There are definitely times where you would want it to stop and exit the process, but for something where you are just doing something simple like this, evaluating a couple fields and doing updated, and updating records related, you're almost always going to want to make sure that that evaluate the next criteria is there. All right. And so the most important, I've probably said that like 6 times already, the most important thing to do, haven't I? But another very important thing to do is to activate any process that you have built. Obviously, as you see me doing, you want to do that in a sandbox first. You don't want to just start building processes in production and activating them and having them be broken and breaking the system for your users. You want to do all of this testing in a sandbox, activating, reactivating, building, testing, making sure it works, and then deploying that to production. Entirely separate conversation and webinar, I'm sure, about making deployments to production. But for here, since I'm in a sandbox, I can go ahead and feel safe activating this process, and activating this one automatically deactivates any other version of this process, but that's going to be saved in my history. Okay. And now we could go on and test this process if we want to. And so let's go ahead and do that. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new contact here. And there we go. And I will keep this brief. I am not going to fill out every field by any means. All right, so let's just put in a first name and last name and hit save. All right, so from here, let's look at the details on her record. And we see that she has no primary affiliation, and obviously no position or status because of that. If we look at the related records and we scroll down to organization affiliations, we see that there are none there. So if we create a new one, and let's connect her to the Save the World Foundation, let's give her the position of president. We'll say it's current, and we'll give it a start date of, she started back in August. Now, I often see my users forgetting to click this primary checkbox. So let's walk through that. And so since primary isn't true, our process should not fire. And if I hit save now, affiliation was created. Let's go back up to the details. Oh, lightning, let's refresh the page. Oh, right, because I didn't select primary, nothing happened. There's no primary affiliation, there's no primary affiliation position, and there's no primary affiliation status. However, if I go back to this record, and because I built out that formula to take care of lots of different situations, is changed on both the position and the primary checkbox. If we edit this and change that to primary and hit save, and we come back to the details and refresh the page, we see everything filled in. Again, this is standard NPSP functionality, but these were the ones we just built in that process. If we wanted to change something about that position or the status, let's do both. All right, affiliation was saved. Let's go back to the details. refresh that page. There we go. We see the position changed to CEO and the status changed to former. All right, so I think that brings us to the end of what I had planned to demo, but definitely want to stick around and answer questions.
Great, thanks, Adam. Okay, so we have a question from Rob. How are you handling issues like refiring of workflow and process when FK fields are updated? When FK fields are updated, reparenting causes the record to be recreated and Salesforce will refire rules.
SK?
FK? I'm not quite sure what FK stands for. I figured it was a nonprofit
Oh, okay.
acronym, but maybe not.
It might be one that I'm not familiar with.
All right, so maybe I could ask Rob if you could clarify. Let's see if there are any other questions.
It's a foreign key.
Oh, foreign key.
Oh. So there's nothing in this one that's going to prevent that. And I definitely agree there probably should be. In this one, since we're not creating new records, in my org, we're essentially not bulk loading affiliations and that type of thing, or doing any sort of bulk deletes or reparenting of people to accounts. It's not going to come up very often. I do agree that you should definitely have things in place where that could happen, but in this process, yeah, it seems like very low risk.
Okay. There were a few questions around if once you're building out a process and you realize you built them in the incorrect order, what can you do to fix it? Is it something that you can drag and drop? And this pertains to the criteria nodes, the diamonds, as well as the actions to the right of the diamond. So if you could show us how you do that and what's possible, that'd be great.
All right. Yes, I think I stopped sharing my screen, so let me share it again. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay. So since I have activated this process, I can't actually change anything about it. Everything is locked. What you need to do is then clone it, and most of the time you're going to clone it as a version of the current process, especially if you're making little changes to it. If you want to start a brand new process, you definitely have that option as well. You can change the name or the description. The one thing you can't change is the API name. That is sort of stuck. And when we've cloned it, we have a new version to work with. And here, yes, as sort of the visual indicator is trying to show us with the multi-directional arrow there, we can drag and drop these criteria into different orders. And we see now that status is being checked before position. If we had more, we could drag and drop them in other ways. As you see, when I switch those around, we would have to look at how it's evaluating the next criteria. Right now, we're stopping after the first one, and so we would want to definitely evaluate the next criteria there. And actually, I was wondering about that one at the bottom that said evaluate the next criteria, and that switched back to stop because there was nothing left to evaluate. So yes, all very sort of drag and drop, easy interface like that.
The thing you can't drag and drop to note is when you do an immediate action or a scheduled action, so a series of those. That's not something that you can drag and drop if you have like two of them.
Like, those are going to fire in the order that you build them in. I've often had to delete and then rebuild the actions Hopefully, though, the actions are a lot simpler than any of the criteria evaluation. Those, at least for me, tend to be a lot easier to rebuild quickly if you want to reorder those.
Okay, the next question is from Beth. How do affiliations work when you merge a record? Likely no big deal, but are there any gotchas, maybe conflicting primary, or does one become former?
Good question. What does happen? It's been a while since I've tested that. I believe that it's because this is NTSP functionality, the surviving record, whatever it has as its primary affiliation lookup here, will retain the primary affiliation on the record related to it. So if we merged two Jane Smiths and one was affiliated to Save the World Foundation and one was affiliated to Disney or whatever, and this was our surviving record, the Save the World Foundation would remain primary. The other one wouldn't change anything except that primary checkbox.
And Pamela asks, any advice on naming conventions for different processes for easy use in other places?
I'm terrible at naming conventions. If it weren't one process per object, like if we were back in the workflow days, I was better about it because I would say exactly what was in there in some sort of name, exactly what it did. With Process Builder, where you're doing as much as you can within as few processes as possible, I tend to just name them the name of the object and process. It means if I have more than, well, so sometimes I will end up with more than one process per object, and I'll distinguish it that way. Like sometimes I'll just need one to only work when a correct record is created on that object. And so everything that's just on the new will be on that one. And so I'll call that my new contact process. And then I'll have another contact process where everything new or edited will be in that process. And that will be, my contact new and edited process. And then obviously things that fall out of those that have to be handled separately, I name for their specific reasons. But yeah, naming conventions get a little tougher when you're condensing all of that into as few processes as possible, and that's where the description field is your best friend.
All right. I'm just going to give a minute or so for folks to ask any additional questions. We're kind of at the end of our questions, so
Yep.
I'll give another minute for last-minute questions. And again, this could be questions related to Adam's presentation or just general process automation questions. We'll take any.
Yeah, we're ready to answer any process automation question here.
Yeah, don't ask us Apex.
Looks like there are no more questions.
Yep. All right, so we do appreciate folks calling into the day before a long weekend for those in the United States. So thank you for that. Thank you, Adam, so much for this presentation for the beginner series as well as nonprofit. We always welcome our nonprofit colleagues to come in here as well. And with that, we're going to close out the session. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
Thanks, Adam.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Happy weekend.